Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Hafey, and I am the Assistant Director for State Affairs for Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins Medicine. And tonight I get to share the virtual stage with four exceptional panelists tonight to discuss decriminalizing mental illness, empathetic mental health supports. This is the fourth installment of the Just Us Dialogues webinar series brought to you by Johns Hopkins University, Johns Hopkins Medicine, in partnership with Johns Hopkins Urban Health Institute. With this series, we've tackled a number of social justice issues ranging from Fourth Amendment, protecting our youth, immigration, and of course, tonight's discussion. And in 2 weeks' time, this will all culminate into a symposium, The Road to Equity, Addressing Health Equity and Achieving Restorative Justice. More information about that symposium will follow after this presentation. And with that, I'm excited and incredibly humbled to introduce our speakers for tonight. We have Lauren Young, who is the Director of Litigation for Disability Rights Maryland, where she coordinates legal work and consultation with clients, consumers, organizations advocating for persons with disabilities. Her work includes lawsuits to address discrimination in transportation, polling locations, hospitals, businesses, sexual assaults of individuals with disabilities in state and community facilities, discrimination in high school athletics, among many, many others. That's just the tip of the amazing work she does, and we're happy to have her here tonight. We also have Dr. Erica Richards, who is the chair and medical director of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health at Sibley Memorial Hospital. She is also an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. She is a board certified psychiatrist, and we're excited to have her clinical perspective on tonight's panel. We have Dr. Rayshawn Ray, who is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institute. He is a professor of sociology and executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland, College Park. His research addresses the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality, with a particular focus on police-civilian relations and men's treatment of women. Dr. Ray has written for a number of publications, including New York Times, Newsweek, Huffington Post, and NBC News, and he has been widely cited in a number of publications as well, and we're excited to have him as well. We also have a special guest with us tonight, Linda Villanueva, who will share her personal experience of the criminalization of mental illness, particularly her experience being arrested when she was in the midst of a behavioral health crisis, for which a loved one requested health assistance and not the presence of the police. Before we get started, one logistical point. You may put your questions in the Zoom chat box, or if you're following us on Facebook, you can put your questions there, or you may text your questions to the number 22333 and type JHUWL in the message. Again, that is 22333 and type JHUWL in the message. And with that, let's just jump right in. Historical context is important. As we know, there's been a very sordid history here. So for Dr. Ray and Lauren, let's tell us about the historic discrimination that led to the use of law enforcement and criminalization of persons with disabilities.
So I think, well, first, thank you for having me this evening. I'm really excited about this conversation, and the panelists are just phenomenal. I really look forward to hearing from them as much as talking. When we talk about mental illness and mental health from a historical standpoint, we have to recognize that law enforcement has always been put in place to maintain law and order. And part of maintaining law and order is not just when it comes to criminality, but also when it comes to who's viewed and perceived as being deviant. Part of thinking about deviance oftentimes is from the perspective of culture, in terms of the fact that people who have a mental illness or a mental health condition are oftentimes viewed as deviant, even though these sort of things aren't illegal, nor should they be. But part of what that means then is that law enforcement oftentimes aims to create a certain cultural ethos, particularly in public places, public streets, public restaurants, even in places where people rent or frequent schools, at work. So part of what that means is that people who oftentimes act outside of the normative ways that people have been socialized to, it can lead to them experiencing an overlevel of policing. Historically, this has meant locking people up, literally putting people in what we would call, or what used to be called, insane asylums. There are many around, from places in Washington, D.C. to Prince George's County, where you see vacant, large types of structures and buildings. There used to be places where they would hold people who were considered to be mentally ill or have a mental health condition. Now, things have shifted a lot from locking people up, at least people who overtly have a mental health condition, to making a shift. But the key point we know is that when it comes to disparities in policing, is that the disparities for people who have a mental health condition compared to those who don't are just as large, if not wider, than the gap we see in policing between the treatment between Blacks and whites. So we know that a lot of people who are incarcerated suffer from mental health and mental illness, particularly from untreated type of conditions. So we continue to see the way that mass incarceration operates. People aren't necessarily in an insane asylums where they're being, whether it be being electrocuted or strapped down with various sorts of treatments or supposed treatments, but people are definitely locked up and incarcerated in the United States for having a condition that oftentimes people see as something that isn't something that can be correctable. And we have to recognize this historical lineage with law enforcement.
Yeah, I certainly agree and appreciate those comments very much, Dr. Ray. Thank you. This is Lauren Young speaking. I'm a woman, short, dark, curly hair. I'm white. I'm seated in my office when I'm speaking with you all. And thank you for having me. I think one thing important to share is the history of disability discrimination, because we're not taught about that. And Dr. Ray alluded to it. I'd like to comment a little bit more about that. We know that racist policing is really rooted in our discriminatory and segregationist history. And while disability discrimination is highly intersectional with race and other persons of marginalized status, it has its own history. And I think that's really important in considering the role of law enforcement and police, because we, if we look back just to the 19th and 20th century, we have taken extraordinary measures to keep people with disabilities out of our public space, which does lead to the mass incarceration that Dr. Ray was mentioning. In the late 19th century, cities across the country had what's known as ugly laws. Ugly laws actually prohibited people with disabilities from being in our streets, in our public space. Chicago's ugly law required that people who were mutilated, people who were deformed, people who were unsightly or disgusting objects, notice the depersonalization. If they were improper persons, they were forbidden from being on the streets. So who is charged with enforcing our laws, of course, is police. As Dr. Ray said, at around the same time period, we saw this growth of asylums and institutions, where instead of having people with disabilities placed in poorhouses, county-run poorhouses, states took over that responsibility and developed these asylums and institutions that became very horrific. Of course, they were segregated as well. Maryland has much of its history to be shameful about, including that at one point for a period of years, people of wealth could petition our judicial system to release young girls and women from one of our institutions, Rosewood, and use them for domestics and often as sex slaves. So we do have a long history of segregating and discriminating against people with disabilities. At the same time that institutions and asylums were gaining footholds, we had the eugenics movement sweeping Europe and our country, which of course called for selective breeding and resulted in documented forced sterilization of at least 60,000 people with disabilities. And our justice system, again, our Supreme Court, decided that that was legitimate. They ratified these practices against people with intellectual disabilities. And they made a very distinctive decision drawing a link between people with disabilities and criminalization. When they upheld the effort to sterilize people, they found it would be better for the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for criminal activities or to let them starve, we could prevent them from being. So you saw that link between people with disabilities and criminal behaviors, which statistics will tell you is not true. Statistically, people with disabilities are more likely to be victims of crime than to perpetuate crimes, and that's true today. But that's not what our culture, our laws, and our cultural norms have taught us. And then we have law enforcement to represent those cultural norms and laws. We had laws that forbid people with disabilities from marrying, right? We had laws that forbid people with disabilities from being educated and going to school until 1975. Again, the reasons, we didn't want them in our public space. We were afraid, according to court decisions, that people with disabilities in schools would be so disgusting to other students that they couldn't learn. So I'm going to try and wrap this up. We have a lot to cover, but there is a whole lot of our disability-based history that we don't talk about that leads directly to what we have now, which we consider to be human rights violation with the mass incarceration of people with disabilities and the abuse in policing. We didn't allow people to work. We still have sub-minimum wage. We didn't prohibit discrimination in employment until 1990s. We institutionalized poverty for people with disabilities by giving folks on supplemental security income less than $800 a month to rent, for food, for clothing, for everything they need. We create this impossible situation, and then we criminalize a lot of offenses related to disability.
You mentioned statistics, Lauren. Can you give us some data about the disproportionate representation of persons with disabilities in jails, in prisons, and in police encounters?
Sure, thanks for that opportunity as well. So according to several studies, one that was done by the Washington Post and one was done by the Rudderman Family Foundation, police fatalities, if you look at the total of police fatalities, anywhere from 1/2 down to 1/3 of those fatalities include people with behavioral health disabilities. 1/3 to 1/2. The ACLU Maryland did a study just based on police fatalities in Maryland from 2010 to 2014 and found similar statistics. 38% of police fatalities during that time period in Maryland involved people with behavioral health issues. Almost half, they didn't have any weapon, and a significant number occurred when people's families were calling for help for the individual, and they ended up getting shot. In terms of jails and prison disproportionality, statistics really vary, anywhere from 30 to 40 upwards to 60% of people in jails and prisons are considered to have disabilities. So it's extremely disproportionate to their representation in the population.
Thank you for that. So this is directed to Dr. Ray, Dr. Richards, Lauren, whoever. Let's talk a little bit about the accommodations, or if any, that law enforcement and the courts have traditionally made for those who fall along the disability spectrum. And actually, we have a question in the chat about this. Are there any realistic prospects for a mental illness defense or mental health court? So I open this up to anyone.
So I can start, but when we talk about mental health courts, yes, they exist. The question is whether or not they're sufficient, whether or not they're really serving the population that's supposed to be involved in mental health courts. And if that's the case, then what happens subsequently if people do end up on the mental health court side of things? Are they getting the treatments that we need? Have we diagnosed either clinically or even from a legal standpoint what that problem is? And if we have, do we even know how to address it? Do we know how to get people into treatments? Do we know how to really help them and to get them out of that system and treated with what's needed to help them move forward and stay out of that criminal justice system? And a lot of people would say that there is nothing even close to adequate at this point to serve that need.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, it's literally extremely unfortunate and almost laughable and disrespectful that the way that we talk about mental health courts as if they're effective. I mean, they fall completely short of their goals. And there are people who appear before courts every single day who is very clear, oftentimes have a mental health condition or mental illness. And one thing that Lauren was talking about is the high number of people who are in prison who suffer from some sort of mental health condition. And there are some things to really highlight, gender in particular, that when we look at the incarcerated population, there's a higher percentage of women who are incarcerated who suffer from a mental health condition than men. And I mean, we're talking about a lot. So 20% overall, the prison population suffer from depression. I mean, about 12% from manic depressive episodes. I mean, 5 to 10% are schizophrenic. I mean, not to even get into thinking about post-traumatic stress disorder and other forms of anxiety. And oftentimes when people come into court, these sort of acts are not taken up. And we have to be clear that the way that oftentimes that starts are family members and friends who call 911 for someone to come and help their loved one, like what we've seen in Rochester. And instead, those outcomes, as Lauren was saying, lead to a detrimental impact. And as Dr. Richards was saying, even if they do something, they are brought to court and oftentimes treated in similar ways as other defendants. And this leads to the high disparity of people who have mental health conditions being incarcerated.
I also think with mental health courts, they don't create new services, right? Which is what's needed. They don't create new services, and they don't intervene before people get caught up in the criminal justice system. And with many such courts, they hijack resources to certain individuals, those before the judge. And so you do have community, family members, community thinking sometimes, oh, I've got to call the police because that's the only way I can get services to somebody. But you also have this revolving door where, and I've seen it in Baltimore City, especially with some of their diversionary courts, where if people don't show up for their court hearings, then they get FTA, failure to appear, and bench warrants, and then they're held in jail and they're held without bond. And that happens a lot. So we have a lot of issues with the mental health courts. And really the hijacking of resources, you understand where this came from. The judiciary wanted to do something about seeing so many folks come across with substance abuse or mental health issues and wanted to get services. So they started ordering them. But it shouldn't be through a law enforcement and judicial encounter. That's the wrong responders. That should not be the place where we develop mental health connections. That's coercive and that's less likely to be effective.
Dr. Richards, we briefly touched on it a little bit earlier, but can you talk a little about the intersection of race and mental health and the significance of this overlap in this discussion of social justice reform?
Sure. So that's a great question. And I think that it's an interesting question, but we know some of the basics. We know that the judicial system is heavily skewed towards minority populations, right? So when we take that, then we have to do a deeper dive in terms of why is that the case? And there's so many different reasons. There's so many kind of schools of thought about this, but one example would simply be from a clinical standpoint, diagnosis. When we look at diagnosis in terms of bipolar disorder, which is a mood disorder, right? You can have depressive symptoms, you can have elevations in mood. when we compare that with psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, what we are seeing is that Blacks are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia compared to bipolar. And what we also know is that a lot of times when people are having psychotic symptoms, now maybe that's because of schizophrenia, maybe that's substance induced, but they are more likely to enter the judicial system than end up in my emergency room. And so when we look at that and we try to piece that apart, we have to understand that it really starts with the diagnosis. It really starts with understanding what's happening and then understanding that as a medical illness, as a medical emergency, a lot of these people should end up in the emergency room for that urgent treatment. And so there's a diagnosis issue. In addition to that, there are studies that date back far. I mean, there's one that was done in 2010, another done in 2000, that will even show that once we have that diagnosis, right or wrong, if we then cohort people that do have schizophrenia, and we look for mood disorders, we look for depression, what we're seeing in that standpoint is that whites are likely 7 times more likely in that cohort to be diagnosed with depression than Blacks. So we're missing a lot of the diagnosis in certain races. We're missing the diagnosis in Blacks that are having mental health issues. We are writing that off as behavior. We are writing that off as they need to go into the criminal justice system. There's many reasons why that's happening, but we have to look at the numbers and we have to know that this disproportionate diagnosis is also one of the things that's creating this issue.
Thank you. The danger of criminalizing mental illness really does manifest in different ways. We have the murder of Elijah Mclean, a young man who was autistic. That happened a year ago, and now we're just gaining recognition for it. And more recently, as Dr. Ray brought up, we have a young man named Daniel Prude who died by suffocation during a police response to his mental health emergency. These are just some of the shocking stories that we have seen of how mental illness has been criminalized and has led to murder. We have Linda here with us tonight who decided to be a part of the panel to share her personal experiences and to educate people's perceptions of persons with disabilities, and for those in crisis, in mental health or behavioral health crisis, to be treated differently. So Linda, will you share your experience with us and how that has impacted you?
Sure. I am bipolar and I suffer from PTSD. On Sunday, April 17th, 3 weeks prior to the episode, my medication had been changed for my bipolar treatment. This could be part of what happened or what not. For 3 days, I did not sleep. I was becoming increasingly agitated. So finally, I had a psychotic break. And my wife, God bless her, tolerated the situation. During that time, I began arguing with her and verbally being very abusive. And it was during that break that she noticed that something was absolutely wrong and she had to do something. I chased her down the street where I pulled her hair and I hit her. And she knew at that point that there was no way she could personally de-escalate the situation, that she had to do something and had to get help. So she called my sister and they discussed it, and they decided the best course of action was to call 911 and request an ambulance, in which she did, and she requested an ambulance several times. The police not hearing her, or the 911 dispatcher not hearing her or paying attention to the cry out that she was giving, sent 2 police cars and a transport van. I, at that time, was out of it. I knew nothing of what was going on. All I knew is I was in the back of a transport van getting ready to be taken to jail. They told her that I was lucid enough to know what was happening and that I would not be going to an emergency room as requested, but I was going to jail instead. 3 days into being in jail, I woke up I came out of the fog that you get when you have a psychotic break, to find myself totally naked in solitary confinement on a cold metal bed with 2 inmates watching me and collecting bonuses for watching me while I was in what they called suicide watch. Now, if I were in suicide watch, why wasn't I taken to the emergency room? During that time, a nurse came in and gave me a cursory exam. I was suffering from hypertension 1, plus my bipolar disorder was in its full-blown stages. They did nothing. They gave me a Motrin, 3 aspirins, and said, deal with it. On the 4th day, they gave me my clothes so I could go to my bail hearing. And at that point, I had asked, why was I even in jail? I had no clue, because I was so out of it from being in a psychotic break. So I spent 4 days in jail on the request of my wife to have an ambulance.
Yeah, I want to say that, you know, it is so clearly in our minds discriminatory what happens here. If you call 911, if I call 911 and say, hey, my son's having chest pains or a heart attack, you get paramedics. If I call 911 and say, hey, my son's having a psychotic break, I'm really worried, I don't know what to do, I need some help, I get the police. It's not because I'm saying my son has a weapon or is an immediate threat. All cases involving mental health calls get a response from the police. That's given what we know about the disproportionality in the criminal justice system and with police encounters being fatal, or as the Department of Justice found in looking at Baltimore City Police Department, routinely using excess force against people with disabilities and harming them instead of making them healthier. We should have policies that do something very different, and that we can do that. We can readily do that. We don't because of lots of things, our discriminatory history, our decision to try and keep people out of view, and our fears, which are not based in a lot of reality, which is why we get the stereotypes and the discrimination that's driving our system. But Linda's a clear-cut example of that. She wasn't a criminal, but now she has this arrest record.
I have an assault 2 charge.
Well, first of all, Linda, thank you so much for sharing your story with us tonight. I know that was incredibly brave of you to do that. And this question, we've started talking about it, but what kinds of reform efforts that we want to see, and I open this up to all the panelists so that we ensure we don't have another murder or horrific ordeal that Linda experienced and described for us. So I open up Dr. Ray, Dr. Richards.
So I think that one of the biggest things that needs to happen with law enforcement is the first big thing. We do need to reallocate fundings away from police departments to mental health specialists and addiction specialists. That's so important. And I know this, I think, better than most because our virtual reality program that we have on police officer decision-making, we have mental health and mental illness scenarios that police officers go through, fully immersive, 360 degrees. And part of the problem is that police officers cannot readily identify when a person has a mental health or mental illness. And particularly, they're much less likely to be able to identify that, to Dr. Richards' point, when it's a Black person or when it's a Latino person. Oftentimes when the person is Black and they're suffering from a mental health condition, it's perceived that they're being defiant, whereas someone compared to someone who needs help. It's really the difference between the way we've done opioids and the way that we treated the crack cocaine epidemic. So part of what needs to happen is we need to make a shift, and what it would look like is forming mental health response teams that could be paired up with law enforcement. But part of it is the mental health specialists will be the ones who are responding to those calls. There are other people who say that we need a completely different number that people will call, so that way we don't necessarily rely on dispatch. I get that point. Dispatchers oftentimes who are trying to relay information quickly can at times forget key pieces of information in this regard. But what happened in Rochester should not have happened, and it wouldn't have happened had mental health specialists been responding to that call.
I think Dr. Ray has really highlighted the issue, and to sum it up, it's a resource issue. What happens is that there has to be additional training. There has to be training on what is the intervention that is needed at this time and what should be done. That's from the police level, that is from the EMT, the emergency response level, who also need additional training in what to do based on how people are presenting. And to that point, when they're having a heart attack, when they're having an asthma attack, it's easy. There is really a series of steps that are utilized to get that person stabilized and then get them to the emergency room. And we need the same thing with mental health. So that's on that resource side. But the other thing that we need, and this is going to be harder to kind of tease out, is better understanding. We are fundamentally different at times. And sometimes, a lot of times that's related to race, sometimes it's gender, sometimes it's socioeconomic status. But what we know is that even the coping mechanisms that we use are going to be different. And so where one population may respond to even the way that you're talking to them, may respond to the words that you use to try to de-escalate them, that is not universal. And understanding the culture of the people that you're going in to try to help is extremely important. And that also comes down to training, that also comes down to resources to being able to do that training.
There are a couple of questions in the chat about ACT teams. How effective would it be to create a sufficient ACT team to address all 911 mental health calls along with Baltimore City Police Department?
I think they should be the first one dispatched out. They will help de-escalate a situation where police presence heightens the situation where somebody is in fear of being forcibly detained or even, in my case, arrested.
So ACT teams, just to make sure everyone understands, these are a group of providers, and certainly you can have a physician or a health practitioner on that group, often a social worker. There's a lot of people trained in crisis intervention, and they are the experts in really how to de-escalate a lot of these situations. So when people are asking about ACT teams, they're utilized now in most places for those that are severely mentally ill, but in kind of growing that and expanding that to really be the first line on a lot of these calls would absolutely be helpful for the population.
I think it comes down to the dispatchers that are taking these 911 calls need to be better trained. It happens at the dispatch level on who they decide to send out, whether they're sending the police or whether they're going to send an ambulance. They need to listen to the people that are calling in for the help.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Lauren.
So I respect the need for training. It's a lifelong educational effort for all of us in many areas of our lives, and it's useful, it's helpful. I don't think it's the answer here. I do not think that training police is the answer. I think the answer is take public health issues away from police and put them in a public health domain. In Baltimore City, we spend about 1% of the general funds for mental health and substance abuse, over 25 times that for law enforcement. So we really need to have a different approach. We should not be criminalizing people because they're having behavioral health issues. We can do a lot better with better outcomes. If we continue to have police as first responders, if we continue to have the same inputs into the system, we're going to continue to have the same outcomes.
So this begs the next question, who's getting it right? Are there jurisdictions out there that are, quote, the ideal state that we would expect in this space? And I open this up to everyone.
I don't think anyone's getting it right. If they were getting it right, the jails would not be filled with the percentage of people that have mental disabilities. So in my personal opinion, there's no one out there getting it right, because we would mimic this all over the state or the United States. It's a national problem.
Yeah, Linda's exactly right. I mean, when we talk about this, you know, talking about places that are getting it right, particularly from a law enforcement standpoint, I agree with Lauren that they shouldn't even be handling these particular calls. It's very clear that they're not capable of doing it. Not only that, the training that will be required for them to do it. I think there is a pathway though. So I'll give a couple of suggestions. One is Montgomery County, for example, their police department has a specialized unit that handles mental health and mental illness. And I've never seen a group of officers be able to respond so well to these calls. Primarily, it's important for people to recognize why this is. There's a difference between identification and being able to identify someone who has a mental health or a mental health condition or a mental illness, and then knowing what to do based on that identification. That is a loaded skill set that oftentimes takes a long time to learn. On the other hand, what they try to do is to train officers over time, have them to take a certificate course, so like 4 courses that allow them to specialize in this. But I think overall, it needs to shift to mental health specialists and experts where this is what they do and they are responding to these calls. Because I mean, we've thrown out a lot of stats, and there are differences between people who have diagnosed severe mental illness, which is probably about 10 to 15% of the calls, compared to what Lauren was saying earlier, a very large percentage of calls for service dealing with someone who is experiencing some form of, even at times, acute mental health or mental illness episode that needs to be handled with care rather than with force, because that is the way police officers are trained. When it comes nationally to police training, officers get about 50 hours of use of force training, particularly firearm training, but less than 10 hours of de-escalation training. We haven't even gotten to mental illness yet and mental health. Oftentimes that's a half a day. That's like 4 hours. So, I mean, all of a sudden you expect for them to be on the street and be able to use the training that they've learned to use force on people. And it's also important to recognize that, again, people who are experiencing mental illness, oftentimes their family members and friends call someone and they call 911 to come and help, not to hurt. And that's why we need to ensure that people who are specialized to handle this can actually be responding to ensure that we reduce the use of force, we reduce the likelihood that they'll be killed, and then we also reduce the likelihood that they're incarcerated for something that they should not be incarcerated for.
Totally agree. Yeah, the Department of Justice sued the state of Delaware a number of years ago based on the number of people they had in institutional settings and psychiatric settings. And they required the state to develop more home and community-based approaches and crisis services. And they prioritized use of peer supports, which I think is critical for our communities. We have so many people with lived experience in our communities that can be useful and gainfully employed and help support other folks when they're having crises. They prioritize supported housing because of the overlap issues with systemic discrimination on housing and wealth and equity. And supportive housing means that you get a place that's stable to live, and then we can talk about recovery and hope and getting stronger and healthier. So they prioritized those things and developed over time a really robust crisis intervention system that includes things like crisis living room models, where people can go and might stay for 3 to 4 or 5 days. There's a limit, but they are received warmly. They are have taken where they are, their approach with trauma-informed care principles, with self-determination, so that they can be engaged and continue to engage going forward because they can develop relationships. So we have knowledge of methods that can work. And in fact, Maryland has a whole law, a statute establishing a robust crisis intervention system. It just isn't funded. So I think we could know what to do, but it takes a political will to switch. And it's easier to continue to criminalize and marginalize people.
One logistical point I want to chime in. If you have any questions, you can text them to the number 22333 and text JHUWL in the message, or place them in the Zoom chat or on Facebook comments. There's a question here in the chat. Can the schools of public health, medical schools step up to offer training and policy recommendations rather than waiting for the police department and government agencies to figure this out?
So I think that the short answer is, in theory, they can. But when we go back to talking about training, there's a couple of things. Number one is, of course, you have to have a population. You have to have people that are interested in serving this population and that still have gone through that training. So if I talk about psychiatry, if I talked about mental health providers just for a second, and if we stay on that kind of category of people that are understanding, right? People that are culturally sensitive. If we look and we take the US population being about 33%, underrepresented minorities in general, then what we're seeing is, even in a field like psychiatry, there's about less than 9% of psychiatrists that are underrepresented minorities in the field. So what we're seeing is that there is a lack of representation in this area. Now, what studies have shown is that even increasing that training that's discussed in the question will certainly help, right? People that train in diverse areas, people that train in diverse populations will have more of that cultural sensitivity necessary. So the short answer is, sure, this training should happen with the School of Social Work. This training should happen with medical students. This training should happen with psychiatrists as well. But I'm still not sure that that's going to translate in enough people really targeting the populations that need it.
And to your point, what can, and Lauren's point a few moments ago, what can families do and what do communities need to know to ensure that they have the right to simply live? I know that we have individuals watching here with sons just as sweet as Elijah Mclean and just as loved as Daniel Prude. So let's activate the community a little bit. What can communities do? And I open this up to Dr. Richards.
Sure. So I think there are a lot of things. And I think, one of the questions is, how do we change this, right? How do we get activated? And one of the important concepts is doing this, right? Having these conversations, Linda sharing her story, with us sharing the numbers and understanding, right? We have to define the problem, at least try to, in order to solve it. And so within these communities, there's a couple of things. Reaching out is important. And again, in our communities, what we're seeing is that we're less likely to seek the help that we need. We're less likely to talk to the therapist, to talk to the social worker, to talk to the psychiatrist, to get that diagnosis. And when that's not there, it's even harder to understand what those next steps are. If someone has a psychiatrist, if someone has a therapist, a lot of times that can be that first call. A lot of times they can get people into the help, into the emergency rooms, into the hospitals when they need it. But when it is such an emergency, then we are limited with what's going to happen until we put the other things that we talked about in place in terms of the trained mental health professionals that can respond in real time.
There's a question in the chat for Ms. Young, for Lauren. What is the Maryland statute that you mentioned regarding funding a mental health response service?
I'm blanking on where that is. I think it's a Health General article. Oh, let me see if I can find it really quickly as we continue to talk, and I'll come back if I can find that.
Sure, not a problem. Dr. Ray, we talked a little bit about this earlier, reallocation of resources. There has been some success in getting resources diverted from the police department to addressing social services, education, and mental health services. What are some of the strategies that were employed to do that?
Yeah, so I think what has to happen when it comes to defund the police, and I've written about this, is we need to take a evidence-based, market-driven approach. For each location, what needs to happen is you need to look at calls for service. You need to look at use of force, particularly based on whether or not a person in this case has a mental health condition or not. And then you need to look at the violent crime clearance rate. And oftentimes what it'll show when it comes to people with a mental health condition or mental illness is that they are less likely to be attacking, they are less likely to have a lethal weapon, and they are more likely to have family members or friends being called. That's part of what we were talking about. That scenario does not suggest force, does not suggest violence, does not suggest a weapon should be drawn, does not suggest that a person should be arrested and incarcerated. It suggests that we should take an approach to create empathy with people who are experiencing that. And we need people who are trained on the health side of things rather than the law and order side of things. So when you take that market-driven approach, you can figure out what percentage of calls for service come in that comes in from family members about someone having some sort of mental health episode. Based on that percentage, then all of a sudden you take those number of calls and the amount of money associated with those calls and you reallocate it to mental health services. I think the same thing could be done for people who are experiencing an episode as it relates to addiction. You take that slice off and you reallocate it. And we really have to be very realistic about how much money we're talking about. I mean, in most major cities around the United States, from Baltimore to DC to Oakland to Houston to Atlanta, every $1 out of $3, 1 out of 3 taxpayer dollars are spent on policing. That's 33%. In some places like Oakland, it's 40%. How much money is spent on social services is oftentimes pennies on the dollar relative to that. Like 10 cents, for example, out of when we talk about this amount of money. So part of it is shifting 5 to 10% away from law enforcement can make a huge dent on the social service side because they're already underfunded. This money could then be used for things like what Angela also Brooks proposed after George Floyd was killed, and really after the fact that Prince George's County police officer shot a man who was handcuffed in his car. But what she said was that we should redirect funding away from the construction or the revitalization of a new police training facility and instead create a mental health facility. And when you create those facilities in communities, all of a sudden you do set the pathway for people having a different number to call. Because if someone has a loved one who has a mental health condition or who suffers from a mental illness, they want to know the resources to call to help them out. And they would be the people who would be most likely to use a different phone number, to call a different set of people to come and respond to those sort of things. So we're starting to see it actualized. We need places, we need structures, we need resources for people who are specialized in these regards to be able to help people who are suffering from any sort of mental health or mental illness.
Yeah, it's beautifully spoken, Dr. Ray. I really appreciate those comments. I do think it comes back to supporting our public health system. I think a lot of people in the public health system know what to do, how to move forward. I think it, again, key components are that it's trauma informed, it involves peers, and it's community driven. And I really emphasize the community driven portion, that we don't want to replace one institutional system with another. And I think that's too often what happens. And we don't want to do that. And I think legally we can't and shouldn't do that, because I think the Americans with Disabilities Act requires us to give community options to people, to serve them in the most integrated setting, and also to avoid administration of public systems and policies that disproportionately harm people or don't give them equal opportunities in our communities. So involving communities is harder than just building facilities, but I think it's critical. We know some of these crisis steps that can happen. We have some good models, and we need to form partnerships. We need to, like you say, activate the community to support these. And I did look up the law that I was blanking on. It is for the caller in Health General article, and it's Title 10, Subtitle 14, Maryland Behavioral Health Crisis Response System.
Thank you. Thank you. There's
not law, just not funded.
There's a question here as we talk about response and relatives responding or calling, contacting the police. There's a question here. As a Black woman, I do not want to call the police. So who should I get into contact with if my relative is experiencing a mental health related episode?
Okay, so this is complicated, everyone, because there's a few answers to this. The short answer is, just to backtrack a little bit, trying to identify the problem as early as possible when you're able to get them to the emergency room. So that's step one. But if we are past step one, we have to remember a couple of things. And one is that we still have to, you still have to ensure your safety. And the fear of calling for help, I mean, this is why we're on this discussion, because there needs to be an overhaul. There need to be additional options that are in place. But if we're talking about real time, then the short answer is, if they will listen to you, if you can get them to the emergency room and it is a mental health emergency, that's where they need to be. And I don't mean necessarily, I mean, there's other things. In Washington, DC, we have these kind of standalone clinics that certainly someone can get to for a mental health emergency as well. So there are some resources in place. But that being said, that's number one, is please make sure that you're ensuring your safety as well. And if we can't get the person who's experiencing the episode to a safe place, you also have to make sure that you're ensuring yours. I'm going around the question because part of that answer is sometimes you will have to call the police. And that's why we're talking about what can change, or hopefully at some point there will be a different number to call for these mental health emergencies, but a crisis is a crisis sometimes.
Right.
It depends where you live, right? It depends where you live right now. I mean, you may have services where there is a crisis hotline that you can call, where people may be able to come out to where you are and talk to the person and see if they can connect enough to diffuse a situation or get supports provided or see if they'll come somewhere else. It's just, you don't have that everywhere. You don't have, it depends where you live, which is ridiculous, right? It should be a healthcare response available to everybody, but it's there in some places. And it also depends how robustly it's supported or funded, because maybe it'll take 5 hours to respond, which you might not have in a crisis.
We're about 6 minutes to time, so I want to give everyone a few closing remarks, a chance to give a few closing remarks to the audience, what the audience should take away, what they should be asking of their elected officials to improve the system. So I'll turn it over to, let's say, Linda.
Thank you. Actively, they need more compassionate training. Police are trained to go in guns blazing. They need to come in and evaluate the situation instead of coming in guns blazing. That's just crazy. I can tell you, to quote my wife, she will never call 911 again because of this episode. So that leaves me in a situation where my mental health now is in jeopardy because of her fear and her trauma of calling police.
Lauren?
I'm going to repeat myself, but I think we have a country where we know we have mistrust in our police systems. And to build back that trust, I think police need to give some power back to the community. And I think this is a perfect place where power gets shifted back to the community. These should not be criminalized matters. They should not involve law enforcement, or we're going to end up just like we are. We need transformation. And so we really do need to shift, as Dr. Ray was explaining, we can shift some of the resources, develop what we know works.
Thank you. Dr. Richards, Dr. Ray, final remarks?
So I think that what I always try to leave with in most settings is that there's hope. We're heading there. And I think that things have been invigorated and that there's a new resolve among the communities to try to get this right. And that being said, we have these issues that are, present along with the pandemic, and mental health is going to continue to suffer, and people are going to continue to struggle to make sense. Some more acutely than others, some more severe than others. But moving forward, understanding the resources that are available and continuing to advocate for what we know is right in our communities is what we need. We have to continue to take this and move forward with that resolve that we can do better as a community.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I agree with everyone's last comments. I mean, it's real simple. We know that people who are suffering from a mental illness or who have a mental health condition should not be incarcerated for that. They should not be brutalized for that. And if police officers are ill-equipped, which they've shown us they are, to handle that, then we need other people to be able to do that. And there's no reason why these calls for service should not be being handled by people who specialize in treating people who are experiencing these particular episodes. And so, look, we're in an election year, and it's not just about who's running for president, it's also about down ballot. And a lot of things happen locally. So from the local, state, and federal level, people need to pay attention to who are the candidates who are really in line with the way they think that the United States of America should go. And one thing I know is that when we talk about policing and we talk about mental health, that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which was passed by the House of Representatives on a symbolic day, which would have been Tamir Rice's 18th birthday. Of course, he was 12 years old, killed in a park in Cleveland while holding a toy gun. He would be a freshman in college right now. And I think about Elijah Mclean. I think about what happened in Rochester. None of those incidents should have happened. And there's legislation on the table where we can put people in place to vote on that legislation to ensure that whether or not a person is Black or brown, whether or not a person has a mental health condition or not, that they can be treated like a human being and treated as if we have a level of empathy for what people are going through at the present time.
Thank you. I think we can continue talking for another hour or so. This was a very thoughtful conversation, and I want to thank our panelists for appearing tonight and giving their thoughts. And I want to thank Linda again for sharing her story, her personal story. 2 weeks' time, we have the symposium on Road to Equity. And of course, I want to thank our audience for joining us tonight. This was a really, really great conversation. Everyone, have a good night.
Thank you. And Dr. Ray, when you run for office, let me know. You got my vote?
I don't know about that, but thank you.